When my brother was born in 1930, he had something the matter with him, and I have no idea what it was. It had to do with his breathing or his lungs or something, and all of the records were destroyed. I mean, even when later on in life we tried.
It smells like kitty poo in there. That's how bad.
Even though later in life we tried to see if we couldn't find out what had been the matter with him. But there were no records left. There'd been a big fire in the record keeping, and they were all gone. But whatever it was, the doctors told my parents that if they didn't take him to a high, dry climate, that he probably was not going to live. This was quite a blow, because my father had an excellent job as a supervisor in the floating plate glass division of Henry Ford. I don't know whether that persisted forever, that Ford made their own glass, but in those days they did, and that's where my dad was working. And we owned our own house in that Ford development area in not Davenport, what did I say before? Oh well, whatever it is. And when we tried in 1930 then.
Dearborn?
Dearborn. So in 1930 then, in the fall, my parents tried to sell their house, but of course no one was buying anything.
Well, that was right in the heart of the Depression.
Yeah, this was the Depression, and no one was buying anything. And my dad had bought a brand new Model A Ford, and so they took a few things out and put them in my grandparents' attic, and packed the car as best they could, put their Atwater Kent radio strapped to the top, and my father packed the space between the front and back seats, and then put a board over it, and then put quilts on top of that, so there was a place for me to lie down or play and so on, and a little spot for my brother's bassinet to go. And when he had packed everything he possibly could into the outside carriers, at that point they decided that it was all they could do. So they said goodbye to my grandparents and their various relatives, and set out for the far west in this practically brand new Model A Ford. There were some fairly decent roads as far as Wyoming, and then the first thing that I remember about all of that was that we turned south to go to Colorado, and the road turned into just a sloppy mud lane. And I can remember my mother getting out of the car and standing in the back behind it and pushing with all her might, my dad being beside the driver's seat and pushing to get out of mud pots and so on. And I can still remember they're pulling up in front of a private house, and the lady came out and saying something like, "Oh, you poor dears, this is the wrong season of the year to be trying to travel to Denver," and so on. But they persisted, and when they got too close to Denver, somehow my dad heard that there was mining at Cripple Creek. And where did you live, Helen, when you lived?
Colorado Springs.
Colorado Springs, right. And so we stopped at Colorado Springs.
Guys? What?
What's he doing?
That was my fingers that was in the door. Honey, get down over there. All right? Can we just leave that, please? All right? He was trying to pull that screen down.
Oh,
I could just see him going over backwards. And
Oh,
pulling the whole
absolutely.
thing down with them.
oddly enough, I'm surprised it was Ryan. It's usually the other one that does the nutty things.
Yes, well, it's a little bit difficult sometimes to record with kids running in and out.
Yep.
Okay, so you were talking about Colorado Springs?
Oh, yes, so when we got to Colorado Springs, my dad thought that we would probably move up into the mountains to the mines and that he would work in the mines. But as it happened, the refinery itself was in Colorado Springs. And Helen, you may even remember the refinery, don't you?
Yes, I do. What remained of it, yes.
Yeah. And so my dad worked there very happily, and we rented a little house which was at the foot of a very large garden estate, and a very elderly lady owned this big estate, and she had a pet parrot. And for some reason, every time I came out into the garden, that parrot, which had had its wings clipped so it wouldn't fly away, that parrot would chase me round and round the garden and nipping at my legs and so on. One of the silly things I remember about that period was how I heard other kids playing further down the block, and I knew I was not supposed to go out of the yard. But I decided that I would go down and see what the kids were doing, and was playing with the kids when my dad came home from work and asked where I was, and my mother looked up and she thought I was out in the yard somewhere, and he went out in the yard and I wasn't there, and he walked partway down the block and he could see me playing with the other children, and I don't know whether he called me or what, but I knew instantly that I had been a bad girl, and so I ran away from him, and I ran down to the corner, but I wasn't allowed to cross the street, so I just turned right and I ran all the way around the block, thinking that I was getting away from my dad, and thinking that he was probably right behind me, only to come around the last corner and get to our gate, and there is my dad standing behind the gate waiting for me. Gave me a good swat on my bum and sent me up to bed without any supper. My mother, a little bit later on, when my dad was doing something else, tiptoed up the stairs and brought me a glass of milk and some bread and butter. But anyway, I've never forgotten that. We stayed there for about 6 months. One of the things that happened while we were there was a beautiful lake. And Helen, you've lived there. Is that lake still there?
I don't remember, Mom, honestly.
Well, there was a lovely lake, and it had I'm going to call it a boardwalk. I don't know what they are, but a floating
Right.
walk that went out into the lake, and there were beautiful swans. And on this one day, my mother and I were there, and my mother was holding my brother, and she had given me some bread to feed the ducks and swans and things, and I had it in my hand, and I went running away in front of her. And I got to the edge and was breaking off bread and feeding it to the birds, and I must have thrown too hard or leaned too far because I fell into the water. Well, of course, my mother was holding my brother. What could she do? And this very elderly lady in an ankle-length dress, a great big hat, and with a huge umbrella, took one look at me, reversed her umbrella, hooked me with the handle, and pulled me in and said, "My, look what I've caught today." So I've often laughed at the thought of me. Otherwise, who knows? What would my mother have done? But anyhow, we enjoyed being in Colorado Springs. There was a lot to do. They both loved to hike, and we loved the Garden of the Gods with all the beautiful rocks, and we would we would go for hikes in the mountains, and if I got tired, my dad would piggyback me and my mother would carry my brother. And
how
so-
old were you then?
Well, I was 3.5 when he was born, and so I guess I was about 4.5. 4.5.
So why did they leave Colorado?
Because my dad was an excellent worker, and the man who was in charge of the refinery came to him one day and he said, "I cannot tell you, Larry, how absolutely sorry I am to say this, but you are laid off." And my father said, "Why? What did I do?" He said, what you did was you were one of the best men I've ever had working for me. But he said, "My son just finished college, and he has looked everywhere, and he has not been able to find another job." And he said, "Larry, family comes first." So my dad went home and told my mother. And my brother was doing very well at that point. And they decided that they had two choices. My father had known some people who had moved to Southern California, people of British extraction who had fought in the First World War. And he kept in touch with them. So he and my mother sat and talked and decided whether to be adventurous and go on to Southern California, or whether to turn around and go back to Detroit, because if they did, they were going to have to live with my grandparents. And my two younger uncles were both all still living at home, which would have made a very crowded household. So they decided to get back in the car and drive on to Southern California and see what they could do. Well, for a very short time, we lived in what these days I think are called motorhomes. Or what are those places, they're
Just a trailer?
trailer camps, And
Did you have a trailer?
no, we didn't have any trailer. What do you call those places where there's a lot of little tiny places?